Okay, this is the fourth lecture in the Iraq series of Iraq lectures. And again, here we are focusing on women. This is a different situation, though, from Vietnam. And so this first topic is Army logic. And I'll put up the slide which indicates what I'm going to talk about. So here you go. Unlike the Vietnam War, where women wound up in combat zones pretty much sort of by accident, as you see with either Linda Van Deventer or Susan O'Neill, who wound up in forward MASH units and actually essentially clocked combat time even though they weren't paid for it. So this is an interesting thing. You had nurses in combat zones, but they were not paid for. They were not given combat pay, even though they were running the risks that men in the same situations were. Some of that has been ironed out by now. Some of it. But by the time the second Gulf War came around, not the first one, because in the first one, women were on the battlefield much more than they had been, but usually in support situations. Often as mechanics, women became helicopter mechanics, they became motor pool people, they were IT people, they were doing all kinds of support roles, but they weren't trigger pullers. This was the main difference, is that women were not allowed to carry weapons. The only women who were allowed into combat, and this goes back to the late 80s, were the combat pilots. And so for the first time, it was actually the Air Force that allowed women into cockpits and into what would become essentially combat roles. So that meant that they were officers necessarily. If nothing else, they would have been lieutenants. But very often captains and more, majors, colonels, and so on. Unlikely to have a colonel flying in a plane, but it's possible. But by the time we get to the second Gulf War, that is what was often called the second Gulf War until it started just to become the war in Iraq and then the Long War, women had been accepted into almost all service branches. By now, as I say, I think it's 99%, and I think the 99%. I have to look this up and see, but the reason for it is that you actually have to have a penis. Like you literally have to be able to wear not a catheter, but it has something to do with. It's one of those situations. But whatever. I mean, it could also just be more patriarchal nonsense. It wouldn't surprise me. But by summer 2015, certainly. There were two women who passed Ranger training, and Ranger training is one of the toughest. You can go ahead and get a Ranger tab, and the Ranger tab is it's just a little, and it's this little arc that says Ranger. That tab, you have crossed into this enormous world of sort of hurt, as they call it, where you have passed through some of the toughest training that there is basically on the planet. And it's very tough. I mean, it's grim. I mean, you have to overcome significant amounts of phobias, and I mean, you got to go out. They don't care. Like if they're training in the middle of the winter, you go out and you're exposed to the winter camping. They give you it's like here's a knife. That's it. You've got what you've got, and that's go survive for a week. It's survival training basically. It's very tough. Yeah, so you gotta do a lot of sort of heavy duty, fearful stuff. Then after that, although Army Rangers are considered to be airborne Rangers are considered to be was for a long time the sort of the peak experience, but then there were the Green Berets. Okay, so that's Special Forces equivalent, and then there were the Special Forces and Special Operations, and then came the SEALs, the Navy SEALs, and these are sea, air, land, which is how you get SEAL. Sea, SEA, air, land. That's the acronym. And the SEAL training is considered to be the grimmest, toughest training that there is. And this is mostly because it takes place in, you're in these deep pools. There's no light. There are no lights on. You have to go through it. You're given a breather, and you're given a lung full of air so you can breathe. Okay, that's fine. And then you have to get into one of these tunnels, and they have these obstacle courses where you're going through the tunnel and they cut your air off, and then that's it. I mean, you basically have to. You're stuck in the center of this labyrinth, let's say, and the labyrinth changes, and you have to, and you're underwater. The air stopped flowing. You know you're in the center of at least a 2-minute tunnel that you have to find your way out of. You have to think about it. You got to get out of it. You got to survive that. So basically, the SEAL training, and so this is Navy soldiers, basically, is designed to weed out people who are phobic about anything. So what you wind up with are these sort of few hundred people who are on these SEAL teams, and they are just not phobic. They're not afraid of insects, and they're not afraid of big dark spaces, and they're not afraid of suffocating to death, and they just aren't wired like that. They're like, oh, I see I'm about to suffocate to death. Oh, bummer for me. They're not afraid of fire, that kind of thing. So it's not unlike firefighter training, very similar, except that you're being shot at as well, and they have live fire exercises. It's very tough. Well, actually, so I think 2 women have just finished the Green Beret training. It's taken some years. I mean, you have to be extremely tough to do this physically already. You have to be in fantastic shape. But then you also have to have this wiring in your head which says, yeah, okay, oh yeah, that's hard. So your blood pressure doesn't rise, and you're being able to make decisions and so on. So these are elite trigger puller situations. The Rangers, the SEALs, Green Berets, other special forces units, which we don't really hear about, and now women have passed into these ranks, and so the whole service is pretty much now open to women. And what this means, of course, is that when the next draft comes, you can see what's following, right? It's like people are like, oh, that's so empowering. I'm like, sure, it's empowering for the government to know that it can now draft the whole population, and that if women, okay, so this push to have American women in the military, and there have been huge fights over this in the last, basically, really the major fights were in the late 80s and through the 90s. And by the time we got to the Second Gulf War, and it turned out that women were already in forward areas because they might be, say, interpreters, or they might be support personnel, but they were already carrying weapons, and they just happened, as what happened with Jessica Lynch, they drove into the wrong area. So now they're in combat. Basically, it's like, well, so basically what can I say? The taboo against American women in combat, American women who are supposed to be, protected and, little princess, and, okay, it's like, no, that went away. Now, remember that the Russians and the Chinese, the Israelis, all have had women in combat for decades, and in combat roles and in heavy roles. But as a feminist, it's hard for me to say that I'm happy about these changes, because it means more people for the military to push around and to victimize. But at the same time, equal rights means equal rights. And so, the only reasons for preventing women from entering combat have been political and patriarchal. So, that has to go, right? It doesn't make the problem go away. And I've tried to give us a picture of some here, like the text we're dealing with, of what it looks like to serve in the military from an enlisted non-officer's point of view, because officers are a different thing. So I wanted to give you some pictures of troops and people on the ground who are, driving Humvees or in Humvees, and they're the gunner. And so what does it look like, basically, from their point of view? Because the officers usually come from higher classes, and they by definition have gone through more school. I mean, you can be a high school graduate, come out and become an infantry person, but if you're going to be an officer, you have to go through a college level program, and not just 1 year. You have to essentially get a degree. So you may be a military college. The credentials of the college may be low quality, But then we've got lots of low quality colleges or universities in Canada too, America, wherever, you know. So, anyway. So I'm trying to set that aside. I'm trying to set the officers aside for this discussion because it really is it would be another lecture.